My name is Michael Tang. I'm the cloud analyst here at the Advanced Research Computing team at University of British Columbia. Um, Thank you for joining us for this session on Don't Get Your Qubits in a Twist. As we proceed with our webinar session today is with acknowledgement of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis nations and communities who have been harmed by colonial and unethical research and of the data sovereignty and research priorities of these nations and communities. On behalf of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, we commit to understanding and taking up our role in reducing harm and advancing reconciliation in research. The Alliance seeks to provide a welcoming, engaging, and safe community for everyone. Discriminatory language is not appropriate in any venue or platform. The Alliance does not tolerate harassment in any form. Harassment is understood as any behavior that threatens another person or group or produces an unsafe environment. We thank you in advance for your ongoing efforts in keeping our environment safe and welcoming. Today's presenters, Scott Baker manages the Research Cybersecurity and Compliance team at UBC Advanced Research Computing, a group focused on supporting researchers to find secure solutions for their project architectures and research data, as well as navigating compliance requirements. He's a member of the Program Leadership Committee for UBC's Privacy and Information Security Management Program. He's also a member of the Digital Research Alliance of Canada National Security Council, where he chairs the Governance and Policy Working Group. We also have Jacob Boucher is a senior systems analyst for the Research, Innovation Solutions and Engagement team at UBC Advanced Research Computing. He oversees new service offerings for researchers and assists with software deployment covering a wide variety of research fields. His own research background is in physics and quantum computing, where he first developed his skill set in research computing. So, and, uh, we will begin the session. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. So this is our Don't Get Your Qubits in a Twist. And I'm going to start things off. And we're going to start off just quickly by looking at, what's the big deal? What are we talking about? So if you've been following at all any of the other conferences or any of the news headlines in this space, it's pretty hard to escape dire headlines, preparations for Q Day, that there's this imminent threat, exploding markets in quantum computing that are going to cause us all kinds of problems as we go forward. And even our own government is, making a big deal about the fact that we have to get ready. We have to get ready quickly to deal with this threat coming from quantum computing. And most of these headlines, when you dig in a little bit deeper, they do talk about the fact that quantum computers can't break cryptography right now, but they're projecting that this is going to happen within, basically the next 5 years, in around about 2030. So, that sounds a little dire, and everybody's got to quickly do something. So Jacob and I wanted to just go through sort of some of the background here and reduce maybe the panic a little bit, talk about, how encryption works, what this threat actually looks like. And I'm going to try to cover off that stuff because I don't understand quantum computing anywhere near as well as Jacob. So he's going to try to explain enough about quantum computing to get your feet wet so that you understand what they're talking about. And also, a little more real world practicalities in this area so that we're all, coming at it from a realistic and sober view and not that panicked view. So I'm going to start off and talk a little bit about encryption. And I'm going to leave this at a level where you know enough to understand the topic related to what we're talking about today. I'm not going into the math. I'm not going deep into cryptography, quantum or otherwise. I'm just going to explain enough so that you can understand what the threats are that they're talking about, why it impacts us, and what it looks like going forward. So the first part of this that's important to understand is you can break down a lot of the encryption that we work with today into two sort of general categories. One is called symmetric, the other is asymmetric. And what they're really referring to is the encryption keys. In symmetric encryption, there's one key. So if I'm sending a message over to Jacob, we would have the same key. I would encrypt the information with that key, and he would decrypt the information with the exact same key. This kind of encryption is a bit faster for a computer to do. It's pretty simple, and it's also pretty much impossible to break if you don't have that key. It's really, really, really difficult. But there's a big problem. There's got to be some way for me to get that key over to Jacob without somebody else intercepting it. And that's the trick. That's what asymmetric encryption generally does. Asymmetric encryption uses two keys, and I would have a public key and I would have a private key. And effectively, the way that works, I would encrypt something with my private key, and then I would send that over to Jacob, and he would already have my public key, and so he could decrypt it with that. So you can, whatever key you encrypt it with, you can decrypt it with the other one. That's basically how asymmetric encryption works. I'm not going to dive any deeper into it at this point, just to say that the asymmetric keys are what we're going to be focused on going forward. And the way they work is with very big numbers most of the time. So they look at using a technique that involves big, big prime numbers to figure out these two keys. And I tried to find the simplest way, the simplest explanation I could for exactly how this works that I think will be easy enough for everybody to grok so that we can get through the rest of this discussion. So basically, this type of encryption, this asymmetric encryption, is generally using a technique called RSA. RSA actually stands for the initials of the people who came up with it. And it uses a very large number. We'll call that number N. That's the public key. So I can give everybody that. I could publish it on my website. And a lot of companies do publish their public key on their website. The trick is the private key is a prime number that is a factor of N. So I'd had two big, huge prime numbers. I multiply them together and I get this massive number N. And the N is the public key. The factor is the prime key. And the reason is the private key. The reason this makes decrypting it hard without the keys, factoring a really big number is really difficult. It takes a lot of work. And for the kind of computers we have today, a lot of work means like thousands of years, millions of years in some cases. So depending on how big that key is, takes a lot longer. Now, note on the bottom, math nerds, people who really are into cryptography, I know I'm oversimplifying this. Please don't get mad at me. Just want to make it simple enough for everybody to understand. And I want to show you like the kind of numbers we're actually talking about here are really, really big. So this is a 3072-bit number. That is a kind of key that is used. That's the kind of length we're talking about. So what we're talking about really is getting a computer to figure out what are two prime numbers that are multiplied together to come to this result. And that's not easy to do. So that's in a note how RSA works. And the key thing to remember is it's about a lot of hard work. Computers have to process, do a whole bunch of math to try to figure that out. Now, there's another way that we hear a lot about in cryptography called elliptic curve cryptography. That's another technique. It doesn't exactly involve prime numbers. It involves these curves. Again, I'm not going to try to explain it. The important thing to remember is that what makes it difficult is the hard work. And I did find a really good explainer for elliptic curve cryptography if you want to read about it. I've got a link there, but the shortcut is it's the Cloudflare blog has a great explanation of elliptic curve cryptography if you want to dive into that. So that's enough of a primer, I think, on cryptography. I'm going to pass it over to Jacob, and he's going to try to explain quantum computing to you in a few minutes. We'll see how that goes.
Thank you, Scott. So since we just went over cryptography, the other key portion that we're going to be looking at is quantum computing. And I'm going to go over just a couple of brief things like what is a quantum computer and how quantum mechanical effects can actually provide utility within the computing space. And then how do we have quantum computers as they are right now fitting into the current computing landscape? and what researchers will be looking at as to how they can both utilize that in their own research and be aware of it for things such as cryptography. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about what our current state of the art looks like in quantum computing and how the developments leading up to that both makes this an interesting field and kind of where it sits us as far as dealing with cryptography and algorithms such as RSA. Next. So to start us off, I'm going to briefly go over what classical computing is. A number of you probably are already very familiar with this, but basically classical computing, everything is oriented around processing bits of data. And those bits are usually stored in a state of 1 or 0 as electrical signals. And usually it is plus or minus 5 volts or a smaller voltage within there. Now, these individual bits, as they're processed, because they are just an electrical signal, you can look at these bits, observe them, copy them, process the data, and they are reliably produce the same result every time, assuming that your system is working well. In comparison, we go to the next slide. We want to talk a bit about quantum computing now. So rather than having electrical signals define what a bit is, in quantum computing, we look at, rather than bits, we call them qubits or quantum bits. And a quantum bit is much like a classical bit defined in a state that has a 1 and a 0. But because of quantum mechanics, we can have a mixture of those two states, such that a single bit is a probability of combination of both 1 and 0 at the same time. And the basis of this is something called superposition. And on the side here, we can see a very common diagram representing a qubit called a Bloch sphere. And this shows kind of a three-dimensional view of what a state of a qubit would be like. So in this case, it is a vector that goes out to the surface of the sphere, and it sits in between 1 and 0 with a certain phase and a certain amplitude of each. And in this case, it's slightly towards the 0 side. Now, qubits themselves physically can be created in a couple of different ways. Probably the most common and most well defined in the research space right now is using superconducting loops. And these are basically loops that are held with very, very low conductivity, allowing multiple currents to flow in opposite directions at the same time. A few of the other methods that can be used to develop qubits would be optical, where you use photons themselves as the qubits and have them trapped within a set of bound states. Or some of the earlier qubit designs were using semiconductors and quantum dots. And in those cases, you'd have, say, trapped ions or so. And in comparison to classical computing, due to the laws of quantum mechanics, when you have a qubit, because it's in that superposition, it's not possible to take that superposition and make an exact copy of it. If you attempt to read out or measure what that qubit is, it will collapse and fall into either a 0 or 1 state. So when you do that readout, it actually destroys what the current state is. And you can't really go forward with saying, I'll make a copy of this qubit, and then I could copy that data. And that's important for another part of cryptography that we won't get into during this talk, but very interesting property. If we go to the next slide. So I mentioned a little bit about superposition, and one of the things that we can work with for the superposition is a property called quantum entanglement. And this allows multiple qubits to effectively be paired together so that not only are they in a superposition between 0 and 1, but they are entangled and operate as a combined unit with multiple qubits together. And this allows, beyond just having 0 and 1, you now can have multiple states all coexisting at the same time across the multiple qubits. So if you have 2 qubits, you could not only just have 0 and 1, but you could have the combination of 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, and 1, 1, all existing at the same time in a superposition. As you entangle more and more qubits, you effectively are encoding more and more information across that in an exponential fashion. Now, this is really powerful because if we have all of those states coexisting at the same time, we can use gate logic as what we would do in classical computing. We can use quantum gates to operate on all of those possible superpositions at the same time. So if we do one operation, we effectively can do that same operation over the entire space of information that could fit into those qubits all at once. And this is obviously extremely powerful, because as you add more and more qubits, you get an exponential increase in the amount of data that you process at one time. If we go to the next slide. Now, all this sounds amazing, right? Like you have an exponential increase in power every time you add more and more qubits. Well, the downside to this is quantum states are innately fragile. It's very, very easy for a quantum state to either lose its superposition or become disentangled from the system. And that usually comes as a factor of external noise. And this isn't just like electromagnetic noise that can be around it. This can be as simple as what's commonly referred to as thermal noise, or just outside energy entering the system. So in this case, for quantum systems, usually these have to be held at extremely cold temperatures, both to minimize the amount of vibrations and to allow them to be well shielded from the outside environment. And by really cold temperatures, I mean, these need to be in the millikelvin range of temperatures. And to do that, you need very, very advanced cooling technology to bring it down below temperatures that would be like liquid helium. Now, some type of errors can actually be corrected, and these are ones that don't necessarily destroy the quantum state itself, but they can introduce errors in your calculation, such as throwing off the phase of your qubits or adjusting the probabilities slightly without actually causing them to collapse. And these can be worked around with a series of things called quantum error correction. And this is usually done by taking multiple physical qubits and you encode them together to act as one logical qubit. So that if you get an error with one of them, the way that you have those qubits arranged and the operations you do with them effectively help mitigate that error, either through parity or other calculations that are done. Next slide. So after all of that information, where do we currently sit in the field of quantum computing for actual physical quantum computers? So superconducting qubits, as I mentioned earlier, is probably one of the areas of quantum computing that has had both the most promise as well as the most investment into. Very large companies such as IBM and Google have invested an enormous amount of time and money into exploring this and researching. IBM is currently the leader for number of qubits, and they have two systems that are their current front runners, which is the IBM Heron and Condor. And the Heron is a 156 qubit system, and the Condor is a 1121 qubit. Now, you might be looking at some of the values here and saying, IBM is well and far ahead with their over 1,000 qubits. IBM themselves has said that the Condor is not as well suited for doing actual quantum computation compared to the Heron. And part of that comes with the large number of qubits do not have a large number of connections between all of those qubits. So even though you have a huge number of qubits in comparison, it's not as good at actually doing the quantum computing as the Heron, simply because getting all of those qubits to talk to each other and entangle is extraordinarily much harder than with the 156 system. Similarly, some of the other large qubit systems would be Google's Willow system, which they're notable for having one of the best systems for quantum error correcting, and the Zhuangzi 3.0 system, which is a fairly new, within about the last year system, developed out of one of the universities in China, and they have also reached about the 105 qubit threshold. Now, in comparison to superconducting qubits, there's a few other notable systems, particularly for Canada. We have the Xanadu Aurora system. And due to the way that optical qubits work, I can't really easily talk about a number of qubits to compare them to, because rather than having a large number of qubits, they use photon states that are confined, and each individual qubit effectively can encode multiple qubits at the same time. It is beyond my own personal expertise exactly how this is done, so I'm not going to try to go into it during the talk, but they are kind of the front runner on the optical side of things. And for semiconductor qubits, a well-known company that has been developing it is called Ionic, and their ARIA system has what they call 25 algorithmic qubits. And this one is a bit of a marketing term, but effectively it is a combination, kind of like a logical qubit, of multiple individual qubits that operate together as a collection. And now to pass it, after kind of this brief primer, I'm going to pass it back to Scott here to talk a bit about what all of this means for the current state of cryptography.
Gotta get the mute. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about cryptography in general. We've talked about, sort of the current what's out there. So based on that, we can conclude right now that there's no quantum computer right at the moment that's going to break this stuff. But the real big fear that everybody's talking about is something called harvest now, decrypt later. HNDL, sometimes they call it store now, decrypt later. You get more wonderfully sensational headlines like the quantum apocalypse. This is what's scaring governments. And in a lot of these articles, there'll be this clause that says because some information has to stay confidential for decades. So the idea is, even if we don't have a quantum computer right now, we're going to get the information and we're going to decrypt it later. So now we can panic about the fact that they're capturing the information right this minute and they're going to decrypt it later. So how does that work? Well, basically, you get the information somehow. So somebody is looking at the data flowing through the internet and grabbing all of it. We all know from past history that large governments are doing this now. Nobody's really disputing the fact that information is being captured. So they're grabbing it all, they're putting it into some kind of massive storage container with the hopes that over the course of time, quantum computers are going to advance to such an extent that they can actually decrypt this information, and then they'll decrypt it and then, I don't know, profit. It's really important to go back to this symmetric and asymmetric bit, because if you recall, I mentioned that the symmetric, as long as that key that we use isn't disclosed, if I keep it secret somehow and get it over to Jacob and nobody else has that key, Quantum computers are not going to decrypt that traffic without the key. What they really want to get is the asymmetric key. They're looking for that key exchange. So when they're capturing this information online, they actually have to get the bit when I send the key to Jacob. If they don't have that bit and they just have the data, it's not going to help them very much. This is also true for data that's encrypted at rest. That's effectively a type of symmetric encryption. You have a key, you encrypt the data. You don't actually send the key to anybody else. You just keep it secret, and the data is encrypted on whatever it's encrypted on. So if you're in that kind of a situation, same thing. Quantum computer is not going to help you so much. It's really that key exchange. So the concern is they're capturing this data like right now. They're getting this stuff, and the risk is that they're going to be able to decrypt it later. So I'm going to pass it back to Jacob to let him explain a little bit about how. How is that going to happen?
All right, thanks, Scott. So once they have that public part of the key, as we mentioned before, for RSA, it is basically working on how do we factor an extremely large number. And for quantum computers, this is actually something that has been theorized and in a small scale tested using something called Shor's algorithm. And what this does, it needs a number of qubits that's roughly about twice the number of bits that the number needs to be stored in. And you then encode effectively the public key or that large number into the qubits as part of the setup, and running through a number of quantum gates, it can go ahead and give you within a certain probability one of the factors of that that key that you or large number that you gave it. Now, how this works is effectively we've got the qubits, and then we do something called modular exponentiation, and each of those in this diagram here is that UA 2 to the second power. And that effectively walks through each of the various bits using powers of 2 and does an exponentiation factor that using Shor's algorithm gives us basically sets those qubits at the top into a state of one of the factors of that qubit. Now, a problem with this is not only fairly complex in the amount of time that it takes, but qubits, as I mentioned before, are inherently pretty unstable. So how long your qubits can last within these quantum states really is one of the other factors that limits how big of a number you can factor with Shor's algorithm. So even if I was to have, say, a 6,000 qubit length qubits that were well entangled and could all be set up, if I can't keep those 6,000 qubits in coherency for the entire lifetime, I'm not going to be able to run Shor's algorithm. Now, if we go to the next slide, one of the benefits of doing this, obviously, is I've mentioned the quantum speedup. So if we have all that data in superposition, rather than attempting to do one factor one at a time and trial and error, which is more closer to the classical approach to how to do factorization, we could effectively operate on that whole superposition of possible output at the same time. And this speedup is really heavily dependent on what the algorithm is that you're trying to do. In the case of Shor's algorithm, this has been, well defined that yes, this improves from having an exponential amount of time needed to process this value down to something that's more along the lines of logarithmic. So as you add more qubits and a larger search space for the number, it actually does not explode in the amount of time that it takes. Other algorithms that are really useful, especially for the research side, are things like optimization and sampling algorithms have been shown to have quite good quantum speedup for their algorithms when they are redesigned as quantum computing algorithms. Excuse me. The getting exponential speedup is therefore theoretically possible, especially for things like Shor's algorithm. It's just practically very difficult due to the kind of limitations on qubits themselves. And if we go to the next slide. So the two biggest factors on doing useful quantum computing is first, the qubit count. If your problem or algorithm can't fit within the number of qubits that you have, it's fairly obvious you can't actually do anything with that. Like you're not going to be able to do a 4,000 bit factorization with 100 qubits because you simply can't encode that much information into it. And the other half of this is, even if you do have the number of qubits, every time that you do a, say, like Shor's algorithm again, your generally large calculations become longer and longer that they need to do between doing readouts. So the large number of qubits needs a large number of operators, and both the time that it takes to do all those operations needs to be considered for how long your qubits can live, but also how do you connect between the qubits that you have on your system. So if you cannot easily talk between one qubit and another, you will have to redesign your algorithm to be even longer to basically connect around those missing connections in your system. Now, the last one is somewhat of a limitation that is more practically solvable at this moment, which is the cost of development. We've already, many of these large companies have already invested billions upon billions of dollars into quantum computing, and the field as it is right now is currently developing, and we're still at around 100 qubits. So this investment really kind of started up the quantum computing race maybe 15 years ago. And we do have a notable amount of progress, but to reach the number of qubits needed for useful factorization, it would take not only substantially more money, but also much, much more research time. And I'll hand it back to Scott here to talk a bit about where factorization sits.
So now we're starting to see some potential problems. And there's been a lot of sensational headlines, as I mentioned. There's also been a lot of sensational claims around factorization. And I've dropped a QR code there for, I'm going to give a couple of plugs to this paper. A researcher in Auckland and another researcher who works with came up with this paper. And I will describe this as, this is what happens when a pair of well-known cryptographers get really annoyed with marketing speak. So the title of the paper is excellent. It's Replication of Quantum Factorization Records with an 8-bit home computer, an abacus, and a dog. And we're gonna dive into this a little bit. So some of the claims that we've heard is a group from IBM factoring the number 15. Keep in mind the RSA key lengths we were talking about are over 3,000 characters long. So we're looking at 15 here. Not 15 characters, but the number 15. Then again, in 2012, they managed to factor the number 21, and we're going to come back to this. And then in 2019, they've got all the way up to the whopping 35, but they failed at doing that, didn't actually work. I'm quoting the paper here. There's been no new records set since then, but there's some announcements of things that sound like they're records since then. And if anybody's paying attention to the news, even as little as I think it was about 6 months ago, there was, researchers somewhere broke RSA was the headline that came out. And that relates to this particular paper about cracking a 2048-bit RSA key. And I want to dive into this because it's really interesting what happened. So that's the number. Don't worry about reading every single digit of that number. And those are the two prime factors that they calculated for that number. The really, really important thing to look at is the fact that those two prime factors are really close together. In fact, they're just a few numbers apart, which means that the big RSA number is almost the square of those two numbers. That basically the same number multiplied together is really, really close. So if you take the square root of the big, huge 2048-bit number, and then just try adding a few numbers, a few digits on each side, you can get to the conclusion of that factorization super fast with a classical computer very easily. You don't need a quantum computer to do that because the number itself is contrived. So this, it's basically a square root plus or minus 3 on each side. It's not there's nothing too staggering here. And it's really interesting to note that numbers like that are not allowed in the RSA specification because of this exact problem. You're supposed to keep your two factors at least 100 digits apart, and quite often they're much further apart than that. You wouldn't even be seeing numbers that look even remotely the same when you're looking at building out your two prime numbers to create that key. So the paper goes on to call this kind of stuff stunt factorizations because, well, the paper is very tongue-in-cheek and it's worth noting. But I wanted to go back to 15 and 21 because they actually cheated too. What they did is something called the compiled form of Shor's algorithm. They didn't start with a complete unknown. They told the algorithm what the answer was when they started and then had it work through to find that known answer. So effectively, if you're trying to break a private and public key pair, knowing the answer in advance, yes, makes that significantly easier. And that's what they actually did in both these cases. So there wasn't really true factorization of the number. It's just, as I said, stunt factorizations. So it does kind of beg the question, why are we dealing with all this smoke and mirrors? And Jacob kind of touched on it. Billions of dollars. If you're spending billions of dollars on something, people are going to want to see results. And so some of the results are starting to sound slightly contrived. And the paper goes on because it's incredibly fun and very tongue-in-cheek. And I will encourage you to read the bit about the quantum entangled sheep because that part really does start to explain the level of, I think, frustration that the authors of the paper were experiencing with some of the claims that have been put forward and how it's making people panic because we're really very, very far away from actually factoring these numbers. So maybe that gets us to think, okay, so it's really not that bad. They're not even close to factoring these numbers right now. But I mean, it's worth going back to looking at the statement about the harvest now and decrypt later. So those are all talking about, information that has to stay confidential for decades. And if you think about some of the most sensitive information that governments are storing, or financial information, or health information, then that actually sounds like, yeah, kind of do need that information to stay confidential for decades. That's important. So if they're capturing it now, we probably should do something about it. But when you think about, in our lens, research data and decades, yes, some research data is sensitive, but the majority of research data is going to be published within roughly the 5-year time frame anyway, because that's how research works. You collect your data, you publish a paper, and with a lot of the requirements in Canada now and other places, you got to publish that data along with the paper in about 5 years anyway. So is this really our biggest threat right now? And I think that's a very important thing to consider, especially in the cybersecurity field. There's lots of potential risks to our data and to our systems. And is the target on research big enough and the risk of these computers that can't break this encryption yet even close? Right now, the thing that we should be really, really panicked about. And it's an important question to ask because there's always more you can do in a cybersecurity sense to protect yourself and your data. So you have to kind of prioritize that. So is this really our priority? So what do we do? What's going on? And this is the part that I think is the most important, that I would say this is your takeaway, if nothing else. A lot of this has already been done. That's really the key takeaway. So as we talked about before, a lot of the encryption that we're trying to break with quantum computers is based on really hard work. It's based on a math problem of factoring a large number into two primes. They've come out with new kinds of cryptographic algorithm that doesn't rely on a math problem. They're relying on other complex math. And again, not going to try to explain that right now. The important thing to know is that it's math that a quantum computer can't break. And that's what we're seeing roll out. This has been underway for a while. And I just went starting to look at major companies that came to mind. I found none that hadn't already started rolling out post-quantum cryptographic algorithms. So Microsoft has done it, Apple's done it, the Signal Protocol's done it, Chrome has done it, AWS has done it. And really importantly, the key library that almost everybody uses for crypto in everything, OpenSSL, also has support for it. So now I'm starting to kind of go, okay, what is this mass panic that we need to worry about if it's basically already being done? And I think the other real important thing to keep in mind is most of us are somewhat reliant on our software vendors and large corporations in the cloud to handle the encryption for us. It's not like if I'm going to connect to a web application where I'm going to store my sensitive research data that I can choose the encryption cipher that's going to be used in my browser when I connect to that thing. I don't have that choice. It depends on whoever wrote the application and my browser's support for that kind of encryption. So when I see that the browsers are building out this support and libraries like OpenSSL are building out this support, I don't have any work to do. It doesn't mean there's nothing to do, and that's always an important thing to keep in mind. I mean, you should always be choosing the best encryption ciphers you have available. This is obviously much more important if you're developing your own application or you're configuring your own system. So just because OpenSSL provides the option of using post-quantum safe cryptography and those ciphers, you still have to configure it to use them. So that is something we could do. Do we have to run around and do it with our hair on fire? Maybe not. And I guarantee in the coming years, that's going to be the default for a lot of systems. But system configurations last for a while. So yes, choose the best encryption cipher you have available to yourself. Always. It's always the right thing to do. We were at a talk yesterday that somebody else was saying these ciphers and these protocols are still changing. And that's true. It's all pretty new stuff. So the best of breed post-quantum safe cryptography might change in the coming years. So you'd change again. But again, you're going to wait for the vendor. You're going to wait for the libraries to support it. So favor those vendors who are following the modern standards. If you have a choice and you can choose between company A and company B, and company B offers these quantum safe cryptographic standards, go with that. It's also increasingly important to patch and update your software now, because those updated software applications are going to leverage the new technology, and they will enable these types of ciphers that may not have existed in the previous version. So that's standard cybersecurity advice anyway. Almost all of these things, it has nothing to do with quantum computing. You should be doing that anyway. And then finally, that prioritizing your mitigation plan is important. Again, we have lots of things that we need to be doing right now to protect our data and protect our systems from bad actors and malicious folks and criminals who are trying to come after us. Is the risk of harvest now, decrypt later the highest on our list? Probably not for most, especially since it's largely being taken care of in the background. And I've put VPN in brackets there because I want you to think very carefully about that and how a VPN would apply in this case. So keeping in mind that the bit they need to capture in order to get access to any of this is the key exchange. They need that private key. That's what they're looking for, because without they need the symmetric key that's going to be sent through the asymmetric channel. If they don't get that key, quantum is not going to allow them to decrypt the data. So if you do your key exchange through a VPN, and the VPN supports post-quantum cryptographic algorithms, but the key exchange is still the old RSA, they don't have access to that key exchange. They won't capture the data because it will be blind to them. So this would be the equivalent of connecting to an old SSH server that doesn't support post-quantum over a VPN connection that does. So you can mask most of your key exchanges by putting them through a VPN that does support a post-quantum or quantum-safe cryptographic cipher if you're worried about it. And so that's something I would watch really, really carefully. Do the VPN technologies that we're using, the way we're actually getting into our systems, are those quantum safe? Because once they are, and we're sending everything through those channels, this largely becomes moot. And it's interesting to note, most of the vendors in this space are selling exactly that. They're selling a VPN channel that you can route all the rest of your traffic through, so you don't have to worry about making everything else in your network quantum safe. I don't know how much I would pay for that, given OpenSSL already has support for it. I'd probably just start configuring things to use it, but that's effectively what's going on in this space. So hopefully that's level set where we are with the quantum apocalypse threat that's going on. But I wanted you to help us collapse our own little superposition about the probability of questions or no questions that you might have at the end of this.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jacob. So for this insightful session, please, for the attendees, please feel free to submit your questions through the Q&A features, and we'll be happy to answer some questions. Or if you would like to converse with the panelists, feel free to raise your hand and I can put you on camera.
I feel like every time I look at the Q&A, I'm collapsing the probability. Well, that's awesome. Everybody understands cryptography, quantum computing. We've covered it.
Did an excellent job.
Yeah, I think so. Well, in that case, then, let me share the last slide. In that case, then, thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your interest and continued enthusiasm for securing our digital environment. This is the last session of the October Cybersecurity Awareness 2025 campaign. For any questions or feedback, please contact us. I'll paste the email address shortly. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.